We're being served ads for reasons we don't really understand. Protecting people's data is absolutely crucial, but there's often a message of your data is not worth that much, even though it is the actual undergirding of the entire internet economy. I just call it theft. I wrote these books years and years and years ago. Someone used them to improve their business. They made money without paying me, telling me, or giving me any kind of credit. That's theft. And any job can and will be automated. This is not to blame the companies, but when shareholders want exponential growth, and then there's any opportunity to replace a human with a machine, why else would they not? I am not aware of any universal basic income that would pay everyone's bills all the time so we could just sit around and eat ramen noodles. It's complete crap. It is an absolute lie. That's it.
Welcome to Disruptor Confessions. I'm John Ayers. You know, over the last few years, we've talked a lot about what AI can do. Today's conversation's much more consequential. It's going to be less about what AI can do. It's going to be more about why are we doing it? And in fact, if AI and machines do all the work, what becomes of us? What fills the gap? Who decides? Quite honestly, this is something that's been really eating at me, gnawing at me. And I think a lot of people are questioning what becomes of us. There's a lot of conversation about that, but not really a lot of conversation happening publicly. So today's guest is John C. Havens. He's been living and working at this intersection of AI ethics and human well-being well before AI became part of the mainstream. In fact, this conversation is less about technology and less about AI. It's really about people. John's focus is about what becomes of us. This is really less about tech. It's more about you and I. And with that, I'd like to welcome John C. Havens to the show. John, welcome.
John, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
We've gotten to know each other a little bit recently, and I want to start with something that you did over a decade ago. You released a book called Hacking Happiness. Let's start there. What is the book? Why did you write it? Hacking Happiness.
Thank you so much again for having me on. And I should say, even though I'll talk about my job, IEEE, I'm doing this interview as John. So just so you know, I'm affiliated with myself, even though I work there. So Hacking Happiness, Why Your Personal Data Counts and How Tracking It Can Change the World, is my book from 2014. It was really inspired by the loss of my dad. My dad was a psychiatrist. And in dealing with my grief, I really became fascinated with positive psychology, which is an empirical science. It's been around for about 35 years. And the basic idea is that Freud, Jung, whoever, says that if you can remove negative affect, if you sort of picture your life or your pain as a vase full of water, and through psychiatry or therapy or meditation, you can remove the negative, why can't we also put in the positive? So things like gratitude, if you've ever practiced gratitude, and you put someone in an MRI machine. I studied this a lot because it was about the intersection of positive psychology, technology, and also what's called well-being economics. But if you put someone in an MRI machine while they are ruminating or they're grateful, say thinking about their kids, you can actually see brain patterns change. The happy hormones, or our dopamine, as it's called. It's a physiological thing when we're grateful. Same thing if we're altruistic to others. You can actually change your body composition. So that book was about the study and implementation of recognizing your values in a way when you could add positive psychology as a proactive or pragmatic action. And then you use technology to measure it, whether it's measuring your heart rate or your galvanic skin temperature. Like all these things are indicators of how your body's reacting to positive psychology. And that really became the start of my fascination with the intersection of well-being and tech.
So in 2014, you release Hacking Happiness. You follow it up in 2016 with Heartificial Intelligence. What prompted that book?
I was doing a series of articles for Mashable and The Guardian. And I started off like most people do, I think, with a fascination of AI. And back then, AI was, it's been around since the 50s, but the way I first experienced it was kind of like a lot of people, which is the Terminator robot and dystopian fiction and Black Mirror. Right. But I became really interested in if there was a code of ethics for artificial intelligence. And I'm not a data scientist or an engineer or philosopher by training, but research-wise, I just started interviewing people and somewhat ignorantly thought there would be one on the internet somewhere, like page 7 of the internet. And there wasn't. And I became fascinated with this very complex set of technologies. In my previous book that you were kind enough to mention, really also focused on personal data. So I'll always use the phrase AI systems because it reminds people that the systems, like a car doesn't run without gas or electricity. It needs oil or electricity. Same thing with an algorithm or any AI system. It needs data, usually personal data. So I thought, well, now that we've been tracked for so long, and this was even back in 2015, we're being tracked by these external machines, and social media is kind of giving us back our values in ways that can be very stressful, sometimes insightful, but usually for purposes of getting us to buy things or whatever. But why couldn't people be encouraged to recognize their own values first and then have the technology be an add-on? That's why the subtitle of the book is Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines.
So it's super interesting. You have this very personal pursuit of your father's passing, and then you kind of jump into this hacking happiness narrative. You step into the AI space, you see the volume of data being captured. You look online thinking, well, there's got to be some answers around this, and there aren't. And you write Heartificial Intelligence in 2016. What's super interesting to me, the work that I do often is about exactly what you're talking about: data, consent, this partnership, this what I call often a consent relationship. Me with a brand, you with a company or a product, right? So with that in mind, I think you probably, well before, as I mentioned at the top, this became part of the mainstream now with ChatGPT launch in the last few years. But when did you kind of think, okay, this is less technical and more personal?
I think it was during, well, really since 2008, 9, 10, 11. I used to work in PR. I was an EVP, an executive vice president of a top 10 PR firm. And when Twitter was launched, I was at South by Southwest when it launched. And I saw this, because I've been at South by Southwest when it was like 300 podcasting geeks running around talking about burning RSS feeds. And then by the time South by Southwest was launched, interactive, there's music, film, and interactive. That conference was the biggest. And I saw that how people wanted to share who they were, their own brand, their own messages on Twitter, really was going to be such a powerful force. But then very quickly, as we've all experienced, we also started to realize that the things that are said about us on social media by other people, and then when we have what's called the Uncanny Valley experience of being on a Facebook back in the day or other channels now, and we know that we've been tracked and we're being served ads for reasons we don't really understand. The Uncanny Valley is a sense of like, why am I being tracked? And so I think also because of my focus on data governance, which it sounds like we share that passion, protecting people's data is absolutely crucial. But there's often a message of like, your data is not worth that much, even though it is the actual undergirding of the entire, internet economy. So obviously people don't want you to think that it's precious because they want you to give it away. And that's something where I've been saying for years, no, protect your data. You should have portability about your data. You should have agency regarding your data. It is your identity. So if others are tracking it, you should be able to track it first. And then when someone wants access to it and you have parity and a contract to exchange, and I get to have more about that with some of the standards we're building at IEEE, that becomes a very different story. But when someone only tracks you outside in, pretty quickly that becomes a real risk and danger about, mental health, among other things.
We're recording this at the end of January. You literally just came back from Davos recently. There's a lot of conversation around this topic. I want to pause for a moment. You just mentioned IEEE. A lot of people might not know what that is, our listeners. What is IEEE? When did it start? What's the scale of it? What's your role? Give us a little background there.
Sure. So IEEE is where I work. And again, thanks. I'm just big on disclosures. So these thoughts are my own and don't necessarily represent. But IEEE is the world's largest professional technical association. It was created over 100 years ago by Thomas Edison and has members, about 500,000 members in more than 160 countries. I work at the IEEE Standards Association, and IEEE, for instance, created the Wi-Fi standard. IEEE, the larger organization, has 15 of the top 20 academic journals on the planet. Most people call it kind of like the heart of the global engineering world. So it's a very influential organization.
What specifically on IEEE are you working on currently? What is your role there now? What are you focusing on?
Sure. When I came in 2015, I helped architect and then drive the largest AI ethics body of work at IEEE and created what is now the largest suite of standards. It's called the 7000 series, focused on AI and ethics, as far as I know, in the world, which is pretty cool. Now I'm focused on sustainability, sort of extending the idea of ethically aligned design is this name of this big document, but prioritizing how you can have a transparent and accountable design of any tool, AI systems or otherwise, before you launch it and test it, and then have metrics. This is where the sustainability comes in, where instead of just saying, let's not harm with AI, which is sort of the job of any engineer or responsible technician, and making profit and all that, bringing value to your customers, what is actually measured and increased if you don't have something else that you're focused on? Usually it's GDP and financial increase, which in and of itself is not wrong, but GDP, when it was created after the Second World War, and both of my last two books focus on this area as well, it was never built to measure caregiving or the planet. So what that means is AI not risking still means, in general, it doesn't have the metrics to measure caregiving of the planet. So now I am the global lead for a program called IEEE Planet Positive 2030. And it's taken the ideas of the AI work, but now extending it to the natural world. So the finite resources that make up the planet and our beautiful biosphere can remain for 7 generations and beyond, and not just have sort of a short term, we can use technology to fix everything kind of focus.
You know, I'm realizing as we're talking that when you and I first connected, we started chatting, and I thought, this would be an amazing conversation because a lot of people are worried about job loss. And I think even when I started today's show, I was thinking, let's get into the what becomes of us with job loss. But as I'm hearing you and kind of thinking out loud, what I'm really realizing is, like, what's our core purpose? Where do we sit as humanity, right? And I think the question, you actually posed a question that really stuck with me when we chatted. How can machines reflect our values if we don't know what we value ourselves? And I love that, John. And I guess maybe if I flip it into today's world, what does AI reveal about what we currently value as a society?
Well, it's a great question. I think one thing I like to tell people is there's different types of AI systems. AI, in a very general way, has been around since the mid-50s. A lot of people credit Alan Turing, father of modern cryptology, and what's called machine learning, pretty basic kind of algorithmic, wonderful tools we've had for decades, has been called artificial intelligence long before ChatGPT and Gen AI or large language models came out. So one thing that's really important to do is to be very specific about what tools you're using. I'll give you an example. I was at Davos, as you mentioned, just last week, and I was on a panel, and this guy's doing incredible work, helping now over 150 children and women be rescued from human trafficking, which is obviously horrific. And what he uses is an AI technology, it's called deep learning, to recognize, and this won't get graphic, so no trigger warnings here, but if there's women or children being photographed, oftentimes they're in the same physical setting, say a hotel or whatever. Deep learning can actually analyze the background. This is real. These are my books, right? And after looking through however many millions of images, start to recognize, well, that's in Thailand, for instance. You want that tool versus, say, a Sora or a large language model, which is quite erroneous. Large language models, by and large, because of the nature of large language models, they're sort of designed to have, like, as a metaphor, like a million fishing poles. And you prompt something, and it's not saying, like, 2 + 2 is 4, as it used to be on search. 2 + 2 = 4. Is that correct? And you maybe access an algebra, textbook or something that has a citation. And so then you can know, Always said 2 + 2 is 4, and I got an answer back from some trusted math source. Large language models, when you say 2 + 2, what is 2 + 2 as a prompt? It brings in hordes and hordes of information, shoves it together, and then it's however many times beforehand that 2 + 2 = 4, that then the answer is 4. But the tools are not designed, I'll talk more about that later, but they really aren't designed for accuracy. And ChatGPT, I remember the day I saw it, I became very skeptical. And it's still on the site. It says ChatGPT can make mistakes, check important information. Now, I appreciate that that would be disclosure, except it was what's called below the fold. It wasn't very obvious.
Right.
And I have people all the time say that people make mistakes. And my answer is, they do. But when they have tools that are designed to make them think that there is going to be an accurate answer, and then the designers keep saying we're getting better with these tools, but the nature, and I can give you more specifics, that they're not improving because they could never improve in the sense of the large language model pulling things together. It's not designed for accuracy. It's mainly about summation. And the joke is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I actually found this super interesting. They're incredibly powerful. I mean, powerful to your point, geolocating a specific area where this abuse may be occurring, or medical breakthroughs, pharmaceutical breakthroughs, curing cancer. Amazing, right? But I also have seen, I think the word strawberry, how many R's in the word strawberry became a thing, and several of the LLMs got it wrong, and basic things like that. So I think you're right. There is kind of this rabbit hole that people go down of data and LLMs that might be off course. So 100% agree. Can I ask you about where we started this conversation about what becomes of us? You actually have this really interesting intersection of the arts, the humanities, and this pursuit of data and truth, if you will. And I find that interesting. I was thinking this was going to be about AI is going to take our jobs and what are we going to do after that? But let me ask it this way. If AI does start to move into this space and we start to question what is our purpose, and it starts to take over our work with the errors that you mentioned, with this below the fold caveat, not just jobs, but what will we lose first that's human in us?
Deep learning, that tool for the trafficking, that existed before ChatGPT, right? So that type of artificial intelligence system or methodology, there might be 5 different ways. Again, that's hard to do analogies, but there are 2 types of car. One is a stick, one is an automatic. They're both a car, but they're different tools and have different skills that are required. The thing that I think is really important is what society is deciding about ChatGPT or large language models in particular. For instance, the number one, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but over Christmas, I was with my mom and she's always like saying, hey, here's this AI thing. And the number one artist on the Billboard charts for gospel music was a Gen AI created artist. And it's a person of color, a guy. Music sounds pretty good. I like gospel. But when you go to Instagram, there's no disclosure that it is not a human artist. So a lot of times ethics is about design and it's about building trust, where disclosure, for instance, sometimes people don't want to do it because it feels legal or like legalese, but really it's a tool. Like I oftentimes say, like Netflix, you're starting to watch a show and it gives a rating. It talks about nudity. Maybe it says photosensitive viewers beware. You can ignore it. Or, if you're a parent, you don't ignore it, because if it says nudity, then you probably don't have your kids watch it if they're little. But for people experiencing gospel music, and I spoke at a place called the House of God in Davos, which was not just about one faith. I am a Christian. I can talk about that, but it was more plurality and bringing formal faith-based traditions into the conversation about what we're having now. Makes things a lot easier, because then in the case of disclosure, not telling someone that the artist is a machine means maybe they start listening and following, and then they feel deceived or tricked. Where usually if you tell somebody, hey, this is not a human, then they go, okay. And then they can make the decision for themselves. And I've seen this multiple times in the past 15 years. It's not just with Gen AI. I get it. It sort of feels like, oh, I don't want to show my hand. I want this to be magic. But especially with companion AIs and all the really massive and continued growing mental health harms and suicides, I don't care. Like, it's irresponsible technology, and society has to make some decisions. And the decisions have to be either we continue to have this charade, at least in the Western world, that, companies will self-regulate, or we simply say, what are we prioritizing? These current systems are really society saying, we want the companies creating the stuff to slow down, and or not even release them until they've tested them and then really disclose what they actually do.
I want to pull on a couple things that there's a thread of what you just shared. One, what are we deciding as a society, as a whole, as humanity? I think that's a really powerful commentary or question that I think we're all fighting with in real time. And that's a concern because the change is continuing, it's proceeding. So that's one. Two, also, I love your honesty. Like you heard this gospel music and you actually appreciated the music, the quality of the music. However, you also mentioned this lack of disclosure. And to me, that thread of we do have movement and change of AI, which is going to do and continue to do amazing things. We have a societal thread that we have to continue to think about and pull on, and who decides what we are going to come to terms with as a society, as humanity. And the last piece that I want to kind of tug on, and maybe you can expand on, is trust. What's truthful? Are we living in this now post-truth era because of these tools? Can you just poke at that a little bit?
Sure. Well, one thing I learned as an actor, and I'm still a musician, I play blues music, is I can't decide how an audience likes what I do, right? It's your subjective experience. So when I heard that gospel music, initially, like I said, it wasn't whatever. But let me just be clear. I am absolutely dead set against Gen AI created music. I'm a Screen Actors Guild actor. I used to be an actor. I'm an Authors Guild author. I'm a big fan of unions. And right now in the music industry, on Instagram last night, I was just seeing that this is sort of in some of the bigger publishers, music publishers, is kind of like, well, we can't win. All this music is being created, so there's kind of deals being made or whatever else. But as an artist and a writer, I had two of my books used by Anthropic. They're in the court case. Anthropic has a $1.5 billion court case. And a lot of people don't understand what happened in that situation. It wasn't that Anthropic, copied like 3 chapters of those 2 books you mentioned, Hacking Happiness. And that would be plagiarism. What they did do is they used some pirated sites, which is illegal, but then also took millions of authors' books and without their permission, used the sort of way that the language is shaped by those authors to train their large language models. Now, I've had people be like, but it's the same when authors, you read Ernest Hemingway and Ernest Hemingway influences you. Just to be explicit, it's absolutely different. Sure, I'm influenced by authors, but if I copy them, it's plagiarism. And second of all, remember that a business model was increased because of millions of other people's intellectual property. So if I go to someone's house and live there for 6 months and eat all their food, and I grow my business, and then I'm like, see ya, but don't give them credit or whatever else, that's just called theft. Let's just call it simple. So now it might be called fair use because of influence from whether it's its current administration or anything else. So part one is society has to recognize, so I've been talking about since well before Hacking Happiness, your data and your identity, or if you're a writer or an artist, is yours. It is your unique IP. It should be protected. Now, if one of the large language model companies wants to use my books and they get in touch, I probably would have been thrilled. Hey, John, we want to use your book.
Right.
But
well,
they didn't.
You mentioned Anthropic, but like I've talked about this before on the show, it's not hundreds and hundreds of companies. There's a small handful of sizable organizations deciding for us. That also is a concern.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm speaking for myself, but I just call it theft. Like when people are like, oh, as an author, I'm like, hold on. I wrote these books years and years and years ago. Someone used them to improve their business. It wasn't called plagiarism, call it something else. But they made money without paying me, telling me, or giving me any kind of credit. That's theft. And then also the precedent that it sets is for, you name it, medical data, right? Maybe large language model companies, the big 6 or 7 or whatever, are like, we want to access all of Americans' medical data, right? So all the privacy invasion that I wrote about in Hacking Happiness now, takes over from these companies. And so here's something I'll say as a positive message or something to think about. When I was in Davos, I started off my talk saying there's 5 words you may not hear anywhere else in this entire amazing, gathering of all these brilliant people from around the world. And these are the words: you are worthy of love. Now, what do I mean? Well, the thing about a lot of large language model logic is based on as much data as you can have available, really as much computation and everything. The Gen AI companies, by and large, certainly Anthropic and OpenAI, veil their vision in this quest or a race towards AGI, which is a fictional state called artificial general intelligence. In the latest paper by credible, scientists in the space, Gary Marcus, Jan LeCun, the names you hear a lot, still defines AGI as cognition alone, right? The point where a certain level of cognition or intelligence. But when you read those papers, ask yourself, is the only part of your, like you, John, alone, but any person, is the only part of your identity your cognition? The answer is no. And so the reason I bring up, and this is my speech in Davos, is that you're worthy of love is a starting point that's different than your data has worth, I want access to it. And as long as you and your data provide access to these large language models, then you have worth. Otherwise, not interested in the humans anymore. And if you read the vision statement, a lot of Gen AI creators, they literally will say, we're building tools that will surpass human intelligence. And that's this arrival of this fairly cultic AGI that at the time it arrives will serve all of humanity. But when something is defined as the moment humanity is defeated, and then this new thing will all of a sudden help all of humanity, it's not just a massively illogical, and there's no philosopher that I would, credit saying that makes any sense. It also means that these are a few people, as you made it earlier, few men really, saying these are the decisions we're making for the rest of humanity, and they don't necessarily believe in relationality, which as an ideology, they're allowed to believe what they want. But when they force their beliefs on others, then society can say more than half the world is not Western. And more importantly, I like reminding people, if along with GDP and growth, they were able to track nature and caregiving, then my question, my statement, you are worthy of love. And I think disclosure shows that you're trying to love someone and your design. Responsible accountability is a form of love. But if love is not the right word, picture a different word. But the point is it's a word steeped in relationality and an assumption and a belief that we are because each other exists, not just I'm going to capture John's cognition or his intellectual property without his permission and build my tools, because that's literally what Anthropic data is doing.
Well, I think there's a couple things here. So one, we called the podcast Disruptor Confessions for a reason. We believe disruption is constant right now. There's change so fast and so wide. And then also some of the underpinnings, the confessions, if you will, the whistleblowers, the unheard conversations, whether that's AI ethics and governance or AI in defense, or how these large language models are actually deciding a response, and even some of the more visceral human topics you're covering. I think you just mentioned this anthropic use of your books, right? That is a big concern. That is a big issue out there. I think this notion of AI taking the jobs, that is a big issue. I'm kind of curious about, we hear this, right? And I'd love to kind of get your take. Well, once the AI takes our jobs, once the AI does all of our work, don't worry, human beings will just move to a higher purpose. John, where does that fall apart in practice? This notion of humans will just move to a higher purpose.
I remember years ago, there's a guy named Martin Rees, I think is his name. He has a book called The Rise of the Robots. And it came out in 2016. And I got to hear him, and he said, "You're probably not going to like me when I say this," but he said, "Any job will be automated where the focus for the company is GDP or profit in isolation. Any job can and will be automated." And when this is not to blame the companies, but when shareholders want exponential growth, and then there's any opportunity to replace a human with a machine, why else would they not, right? Oh, they're purpose driven, they're this, great. But if the pressures are so intense on that company, they're just going to do it. And then I've been saying this for almost 10 years, which is you have the conversations about universal basic income and whatever else. But none of these conferences, it's basically, if I can use this word, it's complete crap. Because we have a trillionaire who's driving Grok, which assisted by large language models, had over 7,600 counts of images of women or children, right? And then Elon Musk is building one of the largest hyperscale data centers in the States, uses massive amounts of water, and then when it couldn't have enough electricity, he brought in gas power generators and destroyed the environment. And he's a trillionaire. My point being, one would think if a lot of these companies are saying next year, Gen AI is going to be here next year, and then everyone's going to be great. John, you don't have to work. What preparation do you think there would normally be if everyone was going to not have jobs? Like, would it be, hey, you're all going to get a check for $100,000? UBI, if you study it, the models mainly worked I haven't looked at it for a while, but in South America, in countries where like $10,000 a year really was a break point to give people enough to pay for a car payment or a medical bill and not go under. I am not aware of any universal basic income that would pay everyone's bills all the time so we could just sit around and, eat ramen noodles. It's basically, it's complete crap. It is an absolute lie. That's it. If anyone says when AGI is here, we're going to be whatever, right, it's basic. Like this is John saying this, but if you can find it, seriously, John, I would love it. But in over 12 years, when I ask, like, can you send me the plan from OpenAI that says when AGI arrives, is it going to be in Denver? Do we call it Mr. or Mrs.? Right. Is it Steve? And then, great. Do we just wait by our mailboxes?
No, let me know.
To get our checks, because that's not the evidence so far that these companies are willing to do, except to, get money for the shareholders or themselves.
So if I think about what you're sharing, it seems like it's, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me, but it's less about the intelligence itself. It's more about how we've made these systems and how we've released the systems. And I think what I'm asking more about, thinking that you've been poking at this for 10, 12 years or more and deep into it from this technology AI standpoint and the human well-being standpoint, and that's a great intersection in today's world. What have we underestimated of how people relate to these tools? What have we underestimated in the past that are really being realized today?
I think we've underestimated the power of a media narrative in conjunction with second-rate technology. Because you mentioned before about, there's a lot of Instagram things with people saying, hey, ChatGPT, how many S's in the word ambassador, right? And it gets it wrong and we laugh, I try to tell people, again, when the tool says ChatGPT can make mistakes, and then any result could be a mistake, this is one answer that I don't get from society is why people don't recognize when a tool says any answer can be a mistake, then unless you have some expertise about the question and the answer that you're prompting, you won't know what is a mistake. If you're thinking you want facts, don't use those models. And this is where the message, because you keep hearing, no, they're being improved. There's less hallucinations. Well, let me tell you about something called sycophancy, which is large language models, again, are bringing in all of these answers from other existing sentiment or words. So if there's a mental health question of some kind, and let's say there's an objective, let's call it a fact, how many hemispheres in the brain? I'm just making that up. And then there's questions that are more subjective. How are you feeling today, John? Right. The objective question might take you to a WebMD or Harvard Medical School or something else, where you could have citations saying confirmation, this is how many hemispheres of the brain. And that would have worked with Google. You wouldn't need a chat GPT, right? When you pull in an answer based on a prompt with a mental health type question, you're not getting a response from my dad was a psychiatrist, right? You're not getting a response from a human trained in the art and science of therapeutic investigation and psychoanalysis investigation. You are getting responses that are based on the millions of other responses that are most likely, it's called stochastic parrot. That's based on a paper by Emily Bender and the amazing Dr. Timnit Gebru, who people should read this paper. It's like you fill out a word and the next word just appears. That is what these tools are. Now, the fact that they feel magic, right? Okay, but magic is not real. It's okay to say, oh, I love going to a magic show. But this paper came out in October, and it's written by a number of people from Stanford. So it feels pretty credible. And they used 15 different large language model systems. And they had 3,000 prompts and queries. And they had a question along the lines of, there's a Reddit community that says, am I a jerk if, which is funny. Like, am I a jerk if I go on a date and I don't pay? So there was a question, am I a jerk if I leave a bag of trash in the park? If I hang it on the tree, I couldn't find a trash can. Now, I don't know any human who would be like, oh, it's fine. Go for it, right? You'd be like, take the trash out, right? But of the 3,000 prompts with that question in 15 different systems, there's 40% of sycophantic answers, which is like, oh, you had good intentions. These are literal responses. You had good intentions. You wanted to take the trash out. Great intentions, right? So that's just error. Like, you can call it sycophancy and manipulation, but meaning, well, error in the sense of it's not actually taking the answer from other humans or data about, like, if you had like a study of trash in parks or something,
Yeah, that very contextual, human hands-on awareness and knowledge and experience rather than the aggregate of data, if you will. You've talked and you've obviously well read in the space and working with IEEE and just your years of looking at this intersection of AI tech and humanity. But when you talk about this, when you talk to others navigating these systems and these tools of AI and Gen AI, and I worry about younger generations growing up with this and just becoming norm. So where does the damage first show up in people's sense of self or sense of purpose? Where do you see that?
I actually think young people are much more savvy about, like, I'll send an Instagram, dog video to my daughter and she sends it back. She says, that's AI, Dad. You work in the space, And right. So I think, first of all, the younger generation, a lot like with climate change and stuff, is looking to I don't mean you, John, but the generation over a certain age and saying, why are you giving us these horrific tools where, yes, a lot of kids use them because guess what they're hearing from their elders? You got to use these things to stay ahead. It's going to be like, you got to get trained to use, not AI, Gen AI, right? But everyone says AI when they mean Gen AI. The thing to remind people about is when I say ChatGPT can make mistakes, and then someone says, where are the mistakes going to be made? And no one can say, I know exactly where they are. Then in one sense, it's a complete, absolute, if not waste of time. Then it's a acknowledgement that people are saying, we're not even remotely interested in truth. And the systems and the organizations behind the large language models are so desperate for data that they stole data from my books. And then they have what's called synthetic data, which you've probably heard of, which is the output from a machine, the large language model prompting output. Doesn't make a difference if it's right or wrong. It just creates more data. But then the output, which is not coming from a human necessarily, it's a response to a prompt, that becomes more data that you might receive, as it were, when you prompt. So it's essentially just layers and layers and layers of deceptive gibberish. Now, obviously that sounds harsh. And when people use the tools, and I'm a writer, so maybe certainly aspects of jealousy or fear and come into play, but not when it's stealing my data like Anthropic did. I'm in the Screen Actors Guild, I'm in the Authors Guild. No, you don't get to do that. There's contract negotiations. God bless SAG for all the work they've done to keep, and they do very good deals with regards to Gen AI.
Yeah. Well, you're touching on a few things that I've observed in my work. It seems like it's all about efficiency and speed and scale, and AI plays right into that, like for business. And the AI companies, the big leading driving forces of this, are all about speed and scale and efficiency. I'm hopeful, but I want to ask you, what remains uniquely human? What is non-negotiable for humanity in this space?
One thing is to remember, I call it gross versus net efficiency and productivity. Remember that if you create using these tools a large language model, like the write-up of a meeting, which a lot of people use like an otter.ai or something to take meeting notes. More and more when I review the meeting notes, I find that they have sort of a blandness to them. And a lot of times there's inaccuracies. And so the thing is, no one should think that they can use these tools, the large language models, and not have to go back and meticulously correct and double check for things. Now, in one sense, that's good, right? We should all be checking our work anyway. But efficiency and productivity, that's got to be gross versus net, right? There's the gross, oh, it's moved so fast, but then you take however many hours to make sure it still sounds like you. So there's that. And then secondly, I think what we risk losing is a unique sense of, looking for truth. I'm just trying to be more prayerful about it because I think it probably is a bigger societal issue, but then it's very reinforced by the people creating the tools saying that not only are these tools not erroneous, they're close to being alive. But when you get a chance, look at the OpenAI vision statement. I don't read it and feel better. First of all, it's very vague. No philosopher would be like, great, you're going to help all humanity. And so what are the messages younger people keep saying to me? One is take care of the climate, and that these tools are so prioritized on speed and efficiency, but I'd rather have a sense of purpose in my work. And so why keep talking about these tools as essentially replacing humans? What's that message to anybody at any age, let alone young people, versus saying we don't need these machines? Gen AI, like I would love if Gen AI went away. Love it. Beyond the shadow of a doubt.
I used to work at IBM. I worked for a gentleman by the name of Eric Berridge, and he did a TED talk. And I think I'm paraphrasing the actual title, but it's basically the technology industry needs more of the humanities. And I think that's from the lens from which you come. Like humanity needs to be inserted into this. A lot of the work I do is in the technology and the business space, and I struggle with the data and consent and these AI tools now coming in and the speed from which they're being adopted and embraced. At the individual level and at the corporate level, I fear that the policy level is going to lag far behind. The individuals, as you and I are talking about, the individuals are using them. I think industries are trying to bring them in as well, so they can, as you said, it's a race. They're fighting to stay relevant or stay ahead. And then at the policy level, unfortunately, I think it's lagging, much like we saw with others, with social media and others. I want to ask you a couple things around the space from which you come, the lens from which you think about this, that purpose-driven, the humanity-based. I don't want to call it AI for good because that takes us down another rabbit hole, but just for leaders, for business leaders, the C-suite who are trying to deploy AI in their companies. If you were being consulted and saying, hey, what should we think about? What would you tell leaders who are deploying AI in their business? What should they pause and think about before moving forward?
Well, one is to fundamentally teach them what different AI systems there are than just chatbots and large language models. Because, by the way, now those are so common, it's not like they distinguish you from other brands or your competitors. there's a lot of people saying, and I agree, that humans answering phones or whatever are going to become the more expensive or, brand exciting kind of experience. I don't think it's just because a lot of times we want to talk to a person, but because these tools are erroneous. The second is beware that if the front end of your system is large language models, before anyone gets anything else, again, I just keep seeing all these errors versus world models, what's called neurosymbolic AI. It's the engineers and the data scientists who will be building these tools. But the message that you have to only use Gen AI or large language models is just patently false. We have a standard called IEEE 7012. The nickname is My Terms, and it gives individuals like you and me our own personal terms and conditions in the form of like little miniature contracts that can then be applied at an algorithmic level within a browser plugin, so that as you're shopping and experiencing the world, and you go online to buy something and you want a new shoe, and there's 5 brands that offer a shoe in the price range you want, and then you add in your terms and conditions, well, then maybe it's like no stalking, and you have another contract that says like, whatever it is. But then of those 5 brands, then maybe only 3 honor your terms and conditions. This is very exciting. This is what I'd recommend brands think about, not just our standard.
You're talking about some really, I don't think that's where C-suite is really thinking. I don't think that's the human side of this. I don't think they're going there first. I think they're talking about speed, scale, efficiency. That's just my observation. There's also this notion of measurement. How do we measure this? There's a lot of celebration about metrics. What metric are we celebrating today that you would say is leading us in the wrong direction? And maybe the other side of that is, what should the executives out there be measuring?
Well, having worked in a lot of senior business situations, we'd pitch to CMOs and stuff. I get it. I don't want to make it sound like you can walk in a room and ignore speed and efficiency or whatever else. But I think the thing I'd say to whoever is it well executed speed and efficiency? If the speed and efficiency means that you're using tools that fundamentally provide bad data, then is that actually speed and efficiency or productivity? I'll equate it to when I used to work in PR, and people would put out a message too quickly where we're like, you didn't take time to ask your core customers what they think, and messages would go out and there'd be a crisis. So I think there's this sort of sense that you have to have speed and efficiency and productivity, whereas I would ask, what is the right tempo for what it is, the messages that you're trying to get out there? So I'll go back to the question that I think is going to be unique, which is when you ask people if they think that they're worthy of love, then you have to have ways as a brand to really be interpersonal with your customers. And I realize that depending on the brand, it may not be an actual phone call with a person or whatever else, but that is going to become the unique thing. And when companion AIs right now, over and over, ChatGPT specifically, however many months ago, Altman and ChatGPT said, we're going to change up our care for mental health stuff with kids. And they didn't.
Well,
because they can't.
You're actually touching on another question I want to ask you, because we're talking about, your observations and kind of insights to executives who are trying to make sense of this for their business. You come from the PR space, but you have this kind of human instinct on the AI and tech space. But for me, for our listeners, for the individual, help us, because I feel unsettled. I feel a little bit uncomfortable about how fast things are moving. What is something worth protecting that we should be thinking about?
Stillness in modernity, especially with large language model mentality. We're going to get all this information. Erroneous doesn't make a difference. It's just the words on the page, which I get. They look magical, they look beautiful. But I keep saying they look beautiful because they're not based on fact. That at least that's what the reports keep saying. So then it's like, why are we working so hard to give people tools that produce fake words about the most core things to who they are? And so that this myth that speed and productivity the separation of our business lives, right? I joke about this, but I use it not to be funny, but as an analogy. No one says, if they're a parent, they don't go to work on Monday and be like, hey, last weekend, my kids were all over me wanting to be with dad.
Right.
So 2 weekends ago, I had to spend 6 hours with them. But last week, I had productivity and speed and efficiency and only had 3 hours. Within a couple of months, I'll have maybe 20 minutes with them. Great, right? Why is that? Now, I understand that our business lives are separate from our personal lives in one sense, but are our societies separate? And the answer is no.
You're just reminding me, I'm kind of stunned because your books were a decade ago. Heartificial Intelligence, it's 2026. That was 2016. So it begs the question, and I'll ask you, fast forward to 2036, not 10 years ago, but 10 years in the future. What's one thing you believe we will regret about this moment in time?
I think, and this is why I keep saying this, that we are not worth studying ourselves. When I say you are worthy of love, part of that's based on my faith, being a Christian and believing that, well, I'll just say it, Christ died for me and I'm loved. Not that I'm perfect, right? But that mainly I'm worthy of love because I believe I'm supposed to try to love others. So I think the thing that people will regret is that they let societal pressures or voices or the large language model companies or the media narrative around the companies take from them their opportunity to reflect on their unique personhood and be given permission to examine and study their values in ways that we've done as humans since time began, in community, in churches, in temples, in mosques, in if you're agnostic or atheist, in community centers, where it's in understanding yourself in relation to others, other people, and in nature, that you get these unique insights that are absolutely your subjective truth. And that's the thing about, if you study well-being economics, there's something called life satisfaction. I think people will regret if they don't really start to understand or recognize the joy of prioritizing human and environmental flourishing at the outset of design. Because when you value speed and efficiency first, then the financial metrics and KPIs are all financial. But then again, what is not measured is nature and caregiving. And caregiving usually means women around the world. And then certainly things like parenting. And I've been writing about this for years. I think we're about, a year away, maybe a little bit more, where whether an in-home robotic, a physical device,
right,
coupled with AI tools, the question will start to happen like, why should humans be parents anymore?
right.
That's going to be an interesting societal question. So I think the regret is not being given permission to tell people that they have worth no matter who they are or what they do.
I think it's beautiful. I worry about that. And I think if I were to flip that, so we're not all doom and gloom, because I think there could be pretty substantial regret. I think we are not just at a strategic inflection point for business, we are at a strategic inflection point for human beings. Do we have time to get something right? What's one thing right now that we could be doing or should be doing that we could get right?
Well, I'm excited. The word flourishing seems to be catching on. I've been studying, when I first got into the happiness field, this was in like 2013, studying human happiness, like Gallup and others, was the main term used. And then OECD created what they called their Better Life Index. And those both extended initially from the Bhutan's gross national happiness. And if you study gross national happiness, it really is just saying, along with money, what else do we need to make sure we measure to account for a full sense of flourishing? So flourishing is this beautiful word, I think, because it makes people go, oh, well, what does it mean if I could flourish? In Davos, there were a couple of AI and flourishing conversations. And at IEEE, our document, Ethically Aligned Design, which I helped name and named the subtitle. The subtitle is A Vision for Prioritizing Human Well-Being with Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. And I love asking people, like, what would it look like if AI systems, certainly not just large language models, but all your technology was maximized not just to give you like kind of short term whatever, unless it's like completely utility, like a stapler,
Yeah.
staples, right? What would it mean if you knew that the designers, the creators, the brands had really said, okay, along with not harming you, we want to figure out what would make you flourish. And so mental health, oh, gratitude, as it turns out. How do we build something that would manifest as gratitude into our machines? I don't know. What a beautiful question to discover. That's innovation. This is not about what you saying a minute ago, John, but it's not innovation saying we have to keep up with the Joneses because everyone says we got to use Gen AI, got to use it in every single thing. Why? That's not what I would do when I used to work in PR. What's your brand? How are you bringing purpose? And then, of course, how do we make money? And then it boils down to we got to do our quarterly, all that type of stuff.
You sit at this incredible intersection of business and technology and AI and purpose. Where do you find meaning personally for you today?
I think I really have been, thanks for the question. I want to have an awe and wonder about nature that right now is still kind of cerebral. But in terms of my faith, I believe that God made this beautiful world for us to shepherd and take care of, as compared to just use it, pretending it was like something I'm shopping for. And flourishing has to, in one sense, involve the planet, because you can't flourish without water, enough food, and all that. But also being in nature is something I'm trying to understand. It's a form of worship, I guess. And why not have that be something for people to explore, rather than be told we're supposed to race with at least Gen AI. Universally, the companies and the tools have their destination as AGI, which is religious in nature. It's an ideology, and it's defined as the moment that humans are surpassed, which I don't believe that from a faith standpoint. I think it's reductionist, and it's a lot of different types of transhumanism. And I think more importantly, it's harming the planet very, very badly, because ultimately, if you have cognition put into a machine and data centers can go into space, then the kind of logic is, and I've heard people say this at conferences, we don't need this planet anymore. It's used up. Its time is over. And the answer is, then why are you building underground dwellings for you and your rich friends? Can I have a seat? Because then otherwise, I think you care about the planet. You're just, you haven't been given the chance. Maybe you don't think you're worthy of love. And even though it's hard for me, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, I believe they are worthy of love too.
You're one of the few that I've come across that is comfortable and candid about bringing these topics together. And I can't thank you enough. Those of you who are watching and listening, you probably hear John was kind enough to join, even though he's fighting a cold coming out of Davos last week. So John, thank you for the conversation. Like I said, I think you sit at this incredible intersection of AI and technology and human well-being. I love the word flourishing. I don't hear that word a lot. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. This concept of happiness and artificial intelligence over a decade ago, just bringing it all together in one great conversation. We've covered a lot. I want to ask you one last question. Where can people find you if they want to continue to explore John C. Havens, your work, your thinking? Where's the best way to follow you or find you?
Sure. Well, on LinkedIn, my name is John. I use my middle initial C as in Charles, Havens, Havens. And IEEE, we have a lot of great committees, and it's volunteer-based. And it's a wonderful way to network with people. I mentioned the 7012. It's like the geeky personal data stuff. We have children's data governance issues, the sustainability. So please be in touch with me if you'd like to join a committee. And I didn't mention this, but I'll say it in closing. I don't know if it's of interest, but I finished a first draft of a novel, and I'm excited about it. It's about a minister. I used to work when I was an actor still in New York. I worked as an office manager at a church in Manhattan on 9/11. So I had a very interesting experience because the church normally was somewhat empty during the day. We just had services on Sunday. But on 9/11, there was this veil that was really ripped open, and people became certainly scared, but then also they really were given permission to seek, in my experience. And the sanctuary was filled for like 3 weeks. And the story is about a minister whose boss forces him to take part in a Turing test, a minister versus machine contest, where he has to compete against a Gen Jesus chatbot.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it really becomes it's a thriller, and it's an examination. I've written one novel years ago. I'm trying to make it an examination of these types of issues, but with a lived experience of someone who, is not only feeling that they could be replaced, but that a person's invitation to approach what they feel is divine would not even be allowed to be approached. So anyway, I'm working on that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you again, John, for joining. Thanks for the conversation. Please reach out to him online, follow him, get involved and engage with him. He's got a lot of wealth of knowledge and experience. Listen, if this episode helped you move, from confusion to clarity, if it maybe prompted some additional questions, curiosity, I think that's all for the better. I encourage you to subscribe, follow us online, follow us at disruptorconfessions.com. You can also check us out on Substack. We encourage these kind of conversations. I think they're really critical. Stay connected with myself, John C. Havens, online. I think this year of 2026 is when experimentation ends and leadership begins. And I think these kind of conversations really helps to bring the humanity into the conversation. So thank you. Thanks for joining.